Setelah hari kerja yang panjang, seorang pengusaha sukses pulang dengan antusias untuk bertemu putrinya. Namun saat tiba di rumah, ia menemukan sesuatu yang sama sekali tidak terduga. Putrinya sendirian dan terluka. Dengan panik ia bergegas menolongnya, tetapi segera mengetahui bahwa kebenaran di balik kecelakaan itu jauh lebih gelap daripada yang ia bayangkan. Chapter 1. The rain was falling hard on Interstate 64 that Thursday afternoon, turning the asphalt into a dark mirror that reflected the car's headlights. Richard Thompson held the steering wheel of his silver pickup truck firmly, anxious to get home after another grueling day of negotiations. At 42, he had built one of the most respected stud farms in the Kentucky countryside, St. Helena's Ranch, specializing in racehorses that competed in the country's main events. His cell phone rang again, and he saw the name Marianne, his wife, flashing on the screen. It was her fifth call that afternoon, but the highway signal was unstable, and the calls dropped before he could answer. Richard frowned, feeling a growing unease in his chest. Marianne rarely called so many times in a row. Usually she was content to send text messages, updating him on the day of Helen, his 7-year-old daughter. Helen was the center of Richard's universe. Ever since his first wife, Caroline, had left when the girl was just 2 years old, he had dedicated himself entirely to ensuring his daughter had everything she needed. Caroline hadn't been able to handle the pressure of being the wife of a rising entrepreneur, always complaining about the loneliness on the long nights Richard stayed late tending to business. One day she simply packed her bags and left for Miami, Florida, leaving only a letter explaining that she needed to find herself again. It was a dark period for Richard. He found himself torn between the responsibilities of the ranch and caring for a small child, but Helen was a strong and cheerful girl with brown curls that reminded him of her mother and bright green eyes that were pure Thompson heritage. She quickly adapted to the routine of the ranch, growing up among the horses and the staff who adored her as if she were everyone's daughter. Marianne came into their lives 3 years ago during a horse auction in Keeneland. She was different from the women Richard knew in the equestrian circuit. Coming from a traditional family from Cincinnati, Marianne had an air of sophistication that contrasted with the rusticity of the rural environment. Her perfectly styled blonde hair, her discreet designer clothes, and her polite way of speaking won Richard over quickly. The courtship was intense and fast. Marianne seemed genuinely interested in Helen, taking the girl on shopping, trips, buying her pretty dresses, and teaching her things that Richard, as a single father, didn't know how to do. When he proposed marriage after a year of dating, Marianne accepted without hesitation, and the ceremony in the ranch's chapel was simple but emotional. The first months of marriage were harmonious. Marianne moved into the main house of St. Helena's Ranch, a large 2-story building with a porch that overlooked the pastures where the horses grazed. She had tastefully redecorated some rooms, bringing a feminine touch that had been missing from that home for years. Helen seemed to like her. Stepmother, affectionately calling her Aunt Mary, and Richard finally felt complete. But in recent months something had changed. Richard couldn't pinpoint exactly what it was, but there was a tension in the air that hadn't existed before. Marianne was more distant, spent hours on the phone speaking in a low voice, and would lock herself in the bedroom when he arrived. She claimed she was helping to organize charity events with her friends from Cincinnati, but she never gave many details. She had also started to complain about the expenses with Helen, subtle comments about ballet classes being too expensive, about the number of toys the girl received from the staff, about how Richard spoiled her excessively. At first he tried to explain that he wanted to give his daughter everything she deserved, but Marianne insisted that he was raising a spoiled child and that they needed to set limits. Helen herself seemed different lately. The cheerful, talkative girl had become quieter, spending more time in her room or playing alone in the stables with her favorite horse, a pinto pony named Thunder. When Richard asked if everything was okay, she would just nod and say she was tired from school. Marianne's brother, Frederick, had also become a constant presence at the ranch. He first appeared 6 months ago, saying he was unemployed and needed some time to get his life back in order. Richard, always generous, offered him an administrative job at the ranch, helping with paperwork and organizing the horses' documents. Frederick was friendly and helpful, but there was something in his eyes that Richard couldn't decipher, a certain cunning that made him uncomfortable. In the last few days, Richard had noticed strange glances between Marianne and Frederick. conversations that stopped abruptly when he entered the room. Low. Laughter that seemed to hide secrets. He had tried to talk to his wife about it, but she accused him of being paranoid, saying it was just the natural closeness between siblings. The rain intensified, and Richard sped up a bit, anxious to get there. There were only 15 miles left to the exit for Lexington, where the ranch was located. He turned on the radio, but the news about politics and the economy couldn't distract him from the restlessness growing in his chest. His cell phone rang once more. This time he managed to answer. "Marianne, I finally got through. The signal was bad on the road. Did something happen?" he said, trying to keep his voice calm. On the other end of the line there was a brief silence before Marianne spoke, her voice sounding strangely controlled. "Richard, where are you? I need you to get home soon." "I'm about 20 minutes away. What's wrong? Is Helen okay?" Another silence, longer this time. Richard felt his heart race. "She's here, but I need you to get here soon. We need to talk." "Marianne, you're scaring me. What happened to my daughter?" "She fell. It was an accident at the stables. Nothing serious, but you need to see. Come quickly." Before he could ask any more questions, Marianne hung up. Richard felt the blood run cold in his veins. Helen had fallen. How? She had known the horses since she was a baby. She knew how to behave around them. And why was Marianne talking in that strange way, as if she were reading a script? He floored the accelerator, making the pickup truck gain speed on the wet highway. The next 15 minutes were torture. His mind raced in 1,000 directions. Helen could have been badly hurt. Maybe she was at the hospital and Marianne didn't want to scare him over the phone. Or maybe it was really just a scratch and his wife was exaggerating. But something in Marianne's voice was off. There was a coldness there, a lack of emotion that made no sense if her stepdaughter had been hurt. A mother, even a stepmother, should be worried, distressed, desperate. Marianne sounded almost indifferent. When he finally turned onto the dirt road that led to the entrance of St. Helena's ranch, Richard's hands were trembling. He passed through the main gate, quickly greeting Mr. Jenkins, the caretaker who had worked there for 20 years. The old man raised his hand in greeting, but his face was grim, unlike his usual smile. The main house stood on a small hill, surrounded by leafy trees and well-kept gardens. Richard parked the pickup in front of the garage and jumped out quickly, running towards the front door. The rain continued to fall, soaking his clothes as he climbed the porch steps. The door was unlocked, which was strange. Marianne always made a point of locking everything, a habit she said she had developed after living in Cincinnati. Richard pushed the door open and entered, calling out immediately. "Marianne, Helen, where are you?" Silence. The house was dark, even though it was only 6 in the evening. No lights on, no sound of a television or music, just the sound of the rain hitting the roof and windows. Richard crossed the living room, his heart beating faster and faster. He quickly went up the stairs to the second floor, checking Helen's room first. Empty. The bed was unmade, as if the girl had left in a hurry. A few toys were scattered on the floor, but nothing out of the ordinary. He went down again and checked the kitchen, also empty. It was then that he heard a faint sound coming from the back porch. A low cry, almost a whimper. His blood ran cold. It was Helen. He would recognize that sound anywhere. Richard ran towards the back of the house, crossing the dining room and pushing open the glass door that led to the porch. What he saw there made his world collapse. Helen was alone, sitting in an old wheelchair that he didn't even know existed on the property. The chair was dirty and rusty, completely unsuitable for a child. But that wasn't what shocked Richard. It was his daughter's condition. Helen's left leg was visibly twisted, at an angle that was not natural. Her little foot was swollen and purple, and there was dried blood on the exposed skin between her sock and the hem of her dress. On her head, a makeshift bandage made of what looked like a kitchen towel was soaked with blood and rainwater. The girl's brown hair was stuck to her face, wet and dirty. She was trembling violently, her lips purple from the cold. When she saw her father, her green eyes filled with tears, and she stretched her thin little arms towards him, trying to get up from the chair but falling back with a cry of pain. "Daddy," she whispered, her voice weak and hoarse. "Daddy, help me." Richard felt his legs go weak. For a second he couldn't move. paralyzed by the shock and horror of what he was seeing. His daughter, his little Helen, was there abandoned, injured, alone in the rain. How had this happened? Where was Marianne? Where was Frederick? Where were the employees? Helen began to cry louder, her body shaking with sobs. This snapped Richard out of his trance. He ran to her, kneeling beside her and carefully taking her into his arms. The girl was freezing, her skin damp and cold to the touch. She clung to her father's neck tightly, burying her face in his shoulder. "Daddy, it hurts so much. My leg hurts so much." "I know, my love, I know. Daddy's here now. I'm going to take you to the hospital. Everything's going to be okay." But as he said this, Richard felt an anger growing inside him like he had never felt before. It wasn't just anger. It was fury, an uncontrollable fury against whoever had left his daughter in that state, against whoever had abandoned her there, alone, hurt and cold. He carried Helen into the house, grabbing a blanket from the sofa and wrapping her carefully. The girl continued to tremble, her teeth chattering as she tried to speak but could only cry. Richard held her against his chest, feeling his own heart break as he noticed the fever emanating from her fragile little body, despite the coldness of her skin. "Where is Marianne?" he asked, trying to keep his voice calm so as not to frighten his daughter even more. Helen just shook her head, her eyes full of fear. Richard realized she didn't want to or couldn't speak. That could wait. The most important thing now was to get her to the hospital. He carried her to the pickup truck, placing her carefully in the passenger seat and fastening the seatbelt. Helen continued to cry softly, her little hands clutching the blanket. Richard turned the heater on full blast and sped off down the dirt road, making the truck skid on the wet turns. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. What had happened? How had Helen been injured like that? Why was she alone? And where the hell was Marianne? She had called to say Helen was there, but she was nowhere to be found when he arrived. And Frederick, the staff. Nothing made sense. Absolutely nothing. Richard looked at Helen, who had now closed her eyes, her breathing irregular. He felt panic take over. "Helen, my love, stay awake. Look at Daddy. Stay awake, okay?" The girl opened her eyes with effort, looking at him. There was something in her gaze that Richard had never seen before. It wasn't just physical pain. It was fear. A deep, visceral fear that shouldn't exist in the eyes of a 7-year-old child. And at that moment, driving under the torrential rain towards the hospital in Lexington, Richard knew that something far beyond a simple accident had happened. Something terrible had happened to his daughter while he was away, and someone was going to have to answer for it. Chapter 2. St. Luke's Hospital of Lexington had never seemed so far away. Richard ran through the corridors with Helen in his arms, his heart racing as he shouted for help. The nurses at the reception desk stood up startled at the sight, and in seconds a gurney was brought. Richard placed his daughter on it carefully, but Helen clung to him tightly, her little green eyes overflowing with tears. "Don't leave me, Daddy. Please don't leave me alone. I'm not going anywhere, my love. Daddy will stay here with you the whole time, I promise." A young doctor approached quickly, assessing Helen's condition with experienced eyes. Her name tag identified her as Dr. Catherine Reynolds, a pediatrician. She signaled for them to take the gurney to the emergency room, and Richard followed, refusing to let go of his daughter's hand. "Mr. Thompson, I need you to tell me exactly what happened," the doctor said as she examined Helen's leg. "I don't know. I got home and found her like this, abandoned on the porch. My wife called me saying it was an accident, but when I arrived there was no one there, just my daughter alone in that state." Dr. Reynolds frowned, but kept her focus on Helen. She immediately ordered X-rays and began checking the girl's vital signs. Her temperature was high, 102 degrees, and her blood pressure was too low for a child. Hypothermia was evident, but there were also signs of dehydration. "How long has she been in this condition?" the doctor asked. Richard felt a lump in his throat. "I don't know. I was working in Louisville. When I got back, it was around 6 in the evening, and I found her like this. And your wife didn't explain what happened. She said it was an accident at the stables. She said Helen fell, but she didn't give any details, and when I got home, she wasn't there." The doctor exchanged a meaningful look with the nurse, beside her. There was something in her eyes that Richard couldn't decipher, but it made him feel even more uncomfortable. While waiting for the test results, Richard tried calling Marianne again. The phone rang several times before going to voicemail. He tried Frederick, but the result was the same. A feeling of outrage began to take hold of him. Where were they? Why had they abandoned Helen like that? And why weren't they answering the phone now? "Daddy," Helen called weakly from the gurney. "Yes, my love, I'm here." "I'm scared." "Scared of what, honey? The hospital? You don't need to be scared. The doctors are going to take care of you." But Helen shook her head, her eyes filling with tears again. "No, I'm scared of her. She said you would get hurt too if I told." Richard felt his blood run cold. "Her? Are you talking about Aunt Marie?" he asked softly, kneeling beside the gurney and holding his daughter's cold little hand. The girl nodded, sobbing. "Her and Uncle Frederick. They said it was an accident, but it wasn't, Daddy. They made Tornado get angry on purpose. He threw me on the ground and I hit my head. My leg hurt so much." She continued, but her words were interrupted by a convulsive cry. Richard felt as if the floor had been pulled out from under his feet. Marianne and Frederick had done that on purpose. They had intentionally hurt his daughter. But why? What had he done to deserve such a betrayal? And more importantly, what did they want? Before he could ask more questions, Dr. Reynolds returned with the test results. Her face was serious. "Mr. Thompson, I need to speak with you in private." Richard looked at Helen, reluctant to leave her, but the girl had finally fallen asleep, exhausted by the pain and fever. He followed the doctor to a small office next to the emergency room. "The news is serious. Helen has an open fracture of her left tibia. She'll need immediate surgery to insert pins and realign the bone. Additionally, she suffered a moderate concussion. The blow to her head was strong, but fortunately, there doesn't seem to be any internal bleeding. However, we'll need to keep her under observation for at least 48 hours. Richard nodded, trying to process all the information. "And the hypothermia?" "We've already started treating it. Her body temperature was very low, which indicates she was exposed to the cold and rain for several hours. Combined with the dehydration and injuries, it's a very serious situation. If you had taken another half hour to bring her in, it could have been much worse." The doctor paused, choosing her next words carefully. "Mr. Thompson, I need to be frank with you. The pattern of injuries and the circumstances in which the girl was found concern me greatly. By protocol, I am required to notify the authorities. The hospital's social worker will want to speak with you, and possibly with your wife." Richard felt the anger rise within him again. "Dr. Reynolds, I understand your protocol, and I completely agree that the authorities need to be notified, because what happened to my daughter was not an accident. It was intentional, and I'm going to prove it." The doctor seemed surprised. "You know who did this?" "I have strong suspicions, but I need concrete proof before I make any accusations." "I understand. In the meantime, we'll prepare Helen for surgery. You can stay with her until it's time to take her to the operating room." Richard returned to his daughter's side, who was still sleeping restlessly. He held her small hand and felt the tears finally roll down his face. How had he let this happen? How had he not noticed something was wrong? Helen had tried to tell him between the lines that something was amiss. She had become quieter, more withdrawn, and he, too busy with business, hadn't paid enough attention. His cell phone vibrated in his pocket. It was a message from Marianne. "Finally." "Richard, where are you? I got home and couldn't find anyone. Is Helen okay?" The audacity of the message left Richard stunned. How did she have the nerve to ask where he was after abandoning her injured and alone? He typed a quick reply, his hands trembling with rage. "I'm at the hospital with Helen. She's going into surgery. Where were you?" The reply came almost immediately. "Hospital? Oh my God, what happened? I was only out for a few hours to go to the grocery store. She was sleeping when I left. I'm on my way there now." Richard didn't reply. He knew she was lying. Helen wasn't sleeping when Marianne left. She was injured, abandoned on the porch alone, in the rain. And even if Marianne had really gone to the grocery store, which he doubted, how would she explain the broken leg, the concussion, the injuries? Half an hour later, Marianne arrived at the hospital. She entered the emergency room with a worried expression, her eyes searching for Richard and Helen. When she saw her daughter on the gurney, she brought a hand to her mouth in a gesture that seemed exaggerated. "Oh my God, Helen, my little one, what happened to you?" She tried to approach, but Richard stood between her and the gurney, his body tense. "Don't you dare touch her." Marianne looked shocked. "Richard, what are you saying? I'm her stepmother. I have the right to see her." "You lost that right when you abandoned her, injured and alone in the rain. When you let my daughter stay in that state for hours, cold, in pain, afraid. I didn't," she began, but Richard interrupted her. "Don't lie to me, Marianne. Helen told me everything. You and your brother did this to her on purpose." Marianne turned pale. "That's absurd. It was an accident. The horse got scared and—" She stopped, realizing she had said too much. If she had really gone to the grocery store and left Helen sleeping, how would she know about the incident with the horse? Richard crossed his arms. "Go on. Finish what you were going to say." Marianne tried to compose herself. Frederick called me. He told me what happened. I was on my way back when you called me." Another lie. Richard could see it in her eyes. "And where is Frederick now? Why isn't he here too?" He stayed at the ranch. He was very shaken up by what happened." How convenient you all have ready-made excuses, but none of them make sense." Before Marianne could respond, Dr. Reynolds entered the room. "Mr. Thompson, we're taking Helen to surgery now. You can accompany her to the door of the operating room." Richard nodded, turning his back on Marianne and following Helen's gurney. The girl had woken up and her eyes widened when she saw her stepmother in the hallway. "No, Daddy, don't let her near me," Helen screamed, trying to sit up on the gurney but being held back by the safety straps. "Calm down, my love, she won't get near you, Daddy promises." But Helen was panicking, her eyes fixed on Marianne as the gurney was pushed down the hall. "No, no, no, she's going to hurt you too. She said she would. If I told she was going to hurt you." Richard felt his heart break. He bent down to be at Helen's level, holding her face with both hands. "No one is going to hurt me, my love, and no one is going to hurt you again, I promise. Now you're going to have surgery to get better, and when you wake up, Daddy will be here waiting. You can trust me." Helen nodded, still crying, but a little calmer. When the gurney reached the doors of the operating room, Richard kissed his daughter's forehead and held her hand until the last second. "Everything's going to be okay, my love. I love you so much. I love you too, Daddy." The doors closed, and Richard stood there for a long moment, trying to control the emotions that threatened to overwhelm him. When he finally turned around, Marianne was a few feet away, her face pale. "Richard, we need to talk." "We have nothing to talk about, not now. But I can explain. It was an accident, I swear. Frederick was trying to teach Helen to ride and the horse got spooked. We tried to help, but—" Marianne stopped again, realizing her stories didn't match. "So you tried to help her, but you left her alone, injured, in the rain for hours. Is that what you're saying?" "It wasn't like that. We—" Marianne seemed desperate, searching for words that made sense. "Where is Frederick?" Richard asked coldly. "At the ranch. He's in a bad way, feeling guilty. Then tell him to stay exactly where he is, because as soon as I leave here, I'm going to have a very serious talk with both of you, and this time I want the truth, the whole truth. Richard, please. It's not what you're thinking." "No." "Then tell me, Marianne, what exactly am I thinking?" She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Richard shook his head and walked away, heading for the waiting room. Marianne didn't follow him, remaining there in the hallway, her face a mask of desperation and fear. In the waiting room, Richard finally allowed himself to collapse into a chair. He covered his face with his hands, trying to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. His daughter was in the operating room, injured by people he had trusted. His wife had lied shamelessly, and the versions of the facts made no sense at all. But more than that, there was something bigger behind it all. Helen had said that Marianne and Frederick had threatened her. They said that if she told, he would be hurt too. What did they want? Money? Control of the ranch? Or was there something darker involved? Richard took his phone out of his pocket and called Albert, his lawyer and friend, of over 15 years. It was almost midnight, but Albert answered on the second ring. "Richard, are you okay?" "Albert, I need your help. It's urgent." "What happened?" Richard told him everything, from Marianne's call on the highway to the conversation with Helen in the hospital. Albert listened in silence, only asking a few pointed questions. "This is very serious, Richard. You need concrete proof before you make any accusations." "I know, and I think I know where to find it. We have security cameras at the stables. If what Helen told me is true, and I believe it is, everything should be on tape. Then you need to make sure those recordings don't disappear. I'm sending someone I trust to the ranch right now, and tomorrow morning I'll file for a court order for the preservation of evidence." "Thank you, Albert. And Richard, be careful. If there was really a deliberate attempt to hurt your daughter, these people are dangerous. Don't do anything alone." Richard hung up and took a deep breath. Albert was right. He needed to be cautious. But at the same time, a cold determination was beginning to form inside him. They had messed with his daughter. They had hurt the most important person in his life, and for that they were going to have to face the consequences. Chapter 3. The first light of morning was beginning to paint the sky when Richard was finally able to see Helen again. The surgery had been a success, according to Dr. Reynolds, but the girl was still under the effects of anesthesia. Richard entered the room with cautious steps, approaching the bed where his daughter rested. Helen looked so small in that hospital bed, surrounded by equipment and with her leg immobilized in a metal frame. Her face was still pale, but at least there were no more signs of the fever that had consumed her the night before. Richard pulled a chair close to the bed and held his daughter's hand, feeling the tightness in his chest ease a little as he saw her breathing peacefully. He hadn't slept all night. After calling Albert, he spent hours trying to understand what had happened. Marianne tried to talk to him a few more times, but he ignored her completely. She eventually left around 3 in the morning, saying she needed to check on something at the ranch. Richard didn't object. In fact, he was relieved not to have to see her lying face for a few hours. His cell phone vibrated. It was a message from Albert. "Got access to the recordings. You need to see this. I'm on my way to the hospital now." Richard felt his heart race. The proof. He was finally going to have in his hands the proof of what really happened to Helen. He looked at his daughter, who was still sleeping peacefully, and left the room to meet Albert in the hallway. His friend arrived half an hour later carrying a tablet. Albert was a man in his 50s, with perfectly combed grey hair and glasses that gave him an air of seriousness. But at that moment, his face was heavy with concern. "Richard, are you sure you want to see this now?" Albert asked. "I have to see it. I need to know exactly what they did to my daughter." Albert nodded and opened a file on the tablet. "Here it is. These are the recordings from the security camera at the stables, near the riding ring where the incident happened. I'm warning you, it's disturbing." Richard took the tablet and pressed play. The image showed the riding ring at St. Helena's Ranch on a sunny afternoon. Helen was there, wearing a light blue dress and her riding boots. She seemed happy, stroking the pony Tornado while talking to him. Richard felt a lump in his throat seeing his daughter so cheerful, unaware of the nightmare she was about to experience. Then Frederick appeared on the screen. He approached Helen with a smile, saying something Richard couldn't hear. Helen seemed hesitant, shaking her head no. Frederick insisted, and the girl finally agreed. He helped her onto the pony, and for a few minutes everything seemed normal. That's when Marianne entered the frame. She was carrying something in her hands, something Richard couldn't quite identify. She approached Frederick, and the two exchanged a few words. Helen remained on the pony, holding the reins tightly as Richard had taught her. Then, suddenly, Frederick did something that made Richard's blood boil. He picked up a stick from the ground and, without warning, struck Tornado hard on the hindquarters. The pony, scared and in pain, reared up on its hind legs, neighing loudly. Helen tried to hold on, but the movement was too abrupt. She was thrown backward, falling violently onto the dirt floor of the riding ring. The fall was terrible. Helen first hit the side of her head on one of the wooden posts that surrounded the ring. and then her body twisted, causing her leg to bend at a horrific angle under her own weight. The sound of the impact wasn't on the video, but Richard could imagine it. He could imagine the sharp crack of the bone breaking, of the skull hitting the wood. Helen lay on the ground, motionless for a few seconds that felt like an eternity. Then she started to move, trying to get up but falling again, her face contorted in pain as she cried. Marianne and Frederick stood still, watching. Neither of them ran to help her. Neither of them seemed surprised or concerned. That's when Marianne approached the girl. In the video, she knelt beside Helen and said something. Richard saw his daughter shake her head desperately, trying to pull away, but Marianne held her by the arm, saying something close to the girl's ear. Helen's face changed from pain to pure terror. Frederick then picked the girl up off the ground, ignoring her cries of pain, and carried her out of the camera's frame. Marianne followed him without even looking back, and the video ended there. Richard felt his hands shaking. He replayed the video again and again, trying to find some explanation other than the obvious one, but there was none. It was as clear as day. Frederick had deliberately caused the accident, and Marianne was aware of everything. "There's more," Albert said softly. The cameras showed that after that, they took Helen to the back porch of the house and left her there. They stayed inside the house for at least 2 hours before Marianne called you. There were other employees at the ranch at that time, but Frederick and Marianne sent them home early, saying they could have the rest of the day off. "Why?" Richard managed to ask, his voice hoarse. "Why would they do that to her? She's just a child." "We're still investigating, but we found something interesting. Marianne is pregnant, Richard, and according to the documents I was able to access, she and Frederick were planning to force you to change your will. With Helen out of the way, the child Marianne is expecting would be your sole heir, and considering she has power of attorney for some of your businesses since the wedding." Richard felt as if he had been punched in the stomach. Pregnant. Marianne was pregnant. And she hadn't told him. She had kept it a secret while planning something terrible against Helen. And whose child was it? His or Frederick's? The way the two of them acted together, the complicit looks, the secret conversations. It all started to make sense in a way that made Richard feel sick. "Do you think the child is Frederick's?" Albert asked, as if reading his mind. "I don't know. And at this point I don't know if it matters. What matters is that they tried to hurt my daughter." "They did hurt her," Richard corrected himself, his voice thick with anger. "And they planned everything. It wasn't an impulsive act. It was premeditated, calculated. The evidence is solid, Richard. With these videos and Helen's testimony, we have a very strong case. I'm going to file all legal measures today. I've already requested protective orders for you and Helen. Marianne and Frederick will not be able to come near you." "And what about my businesses? The power of attorney I gave her? We'll revoke it immediately. And considering the gravity of the situation, I'll request a freeze on all shared assets until everything is resolved. She won't be able to take a single penny from you." Richard nodded, but his mind was far from legal and financial matters. He kept seeing in his mind the image of Helen falling from that pony, the terror on her face when Marianne spoke to her. His little girl had been through a nightmare, and he wasn't there to protect her. "Daddy!" The weak voice made Richard turn immediately. Helen had woken up. He quickly entered the room with Albert following close behind. "My love, how are you feeling?" "It hurts, Daddy. My leg hurts a lot." "I know, honey. But the doctor said you're going to be okay. It will take some time to recover, but you'll be fine." Helen looked around the room, her eyes filling with tears. "Is she here? Is Aunt Mary here?" "No, my love. She's gone, and she won't be able to come near you ever again, Daddy promises. She hurt me, Daddy. Her and Uncle Frederick, they told me to be quiet. They said if I told you they would do the same thing to you. I was so scared." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, holding his daughter carefully so as not to hurt her leg. "I know, my love. I saw what they did. And they are going to pay for it. But you're safe now. Daddy is here, and I won't let anyone hurt you again." Helen sobbed against her father's chest, and Richard felt his own tears roll. How had he been so blind? How had he trusted people who were capable of doing something so horrible to an innocent child? Albert stepped forward. "Helen, my name is Albert. I'm a lawyer and a friend of your dad's. Do you think you could tell me everything that happened? I know it's hard, but it would be very important to make sure the people who did this to you can't hurt anyone else." Helen looked at her father, who nodded encouragingly. "It's safe, my love. You can tell Uncle Albert." The girl began to speak, her voice weak but steady. She told how Frederick had insisted she ride Tornado, even though she said she was scared. How Marianne had appeared and the two of them talked in low voices, looking at her. How the pony suddenly got scared, and she fell. How much it hurt, how she couldn't move properly. "And after I fell, Aunt Mary came to me. She said it was an accident, but that I couldn't tell anyone. She said if I told they would think I was a disobedient girl and that Daddy would be mad at me. And then she said if I told anyway, she would make Daddy have an accident too, just like mine. I was so scared, Daddy. I didn't want you to get hurt. You did nothing wrong, my love. None of this was your fault, do you understand? You are a very brave girl, and Daddy is very proud of you." Albert took careful notes, asking a few questions when necessary. When Helen finally finished, she was exhausted. Dr. Reynolds entered the room at that moment, quickly assessing the situation. "She needs to rest. The recovery will be long and stress won't help." Richard agreed, helping Helen get more comfortable in bed. He stayed with her until she fell asleep again, her little hand holding his tightly. When he finally left the room, Albert was waiting in the hallway. "This is more than enough, Richard. With the video and Helen's testimony, we have everything we need. I'm going to prosecute Marianne and Frederick by all possible means. They will answer for this." Richard nodded, but a new worry arose in his mind. What if they run? What if they find out we have the evidence and decide to disappear? "I've already thought of that. I've asked some acquaintances of mine to keep an eye on the ranch. If they try to leave town, we'll know, and the police have already been notified. They're preparing a temporary arrest warrant based on the evidence we've presented." "How long will it take?" "If all goes well, by the end of the day. But Richard, you need to be prepared for what's coming. This is going to be a long and painful process. The media might get involved considering your position in society, and you'll have to relive all of this several times in court." "I know. But it doesn't matter how long it takes. It doesn't matter how hard it is. They need to pay for what they did, for Helen, for all the children who could be their next victims." Albert squeezed his friend's shoulder. "We will get justice, Richard. I promise." As Albert said goodbye and left to handle the legal procedures, Richard stood there in the hallway, looking out the window. The sun was fully rising now, bringing a new day. But for Richard, everything had changed. His life would never be the same. The trust he had in people was broken, and the anger he felt was something he knew would take a long time to process. But there was something greater than his anger. There was Helen, his daughter who, despite everything, had survived, who was strong and brave. And Richard would do anything, absolutely anything, to ensure she could grow up safe and happy, far from anyone who could ever hurt her again. Chapter 4. 2 days had passed since Helen was admitted, and the hospital had become a second home for Richard. He never left his daughter's side, sleeping in an uncomfortable armchair next to her bed and refusing to leave for more than a few minutes. Dr. Reynolds had commented that she had never seen such a dedicated father, but for Richard, there was no other option. He had failed to protect Helen before. He would not fail again. Helen was recovering well physically, according to the doctors. The surgery had been a success, and the fracture was beginning to set with the help of the pins. The concussion also showed signs of improvement, with no apparent long-term effects. But emotionally, the girl was clearly traumatized. She had constant nightmares and would wake up screaming, begging to keep Marianne away. She was startled by any sudden noise and refused to be alone even for a few seconds. A child psychologist, Dr. Beatrice Sutton, had begun to see her. She was a woman in her 40s, with a motherly demeanor that helped Helen feel more comfortable. She explained to Richard that the trauma was expected, and that it would take time for the girl to process everything that had happened. "Helen will need therapy for a long time," Dr. Sutton told Richard, as they waited outside the room where the girl was resting. What she experienced was a profound betrayal by people who were supposed to care for her. This affects the ability to trust, to feel safe, but with proper support and a lot of love, she can recover completely. "I'll do whatever it takes," Richard assured her. "She can have all the sessions she needs, all the support necessary. Money is not an issue." "It's not about money, Mr. Thompson. It's about presence. Helen needs to know that you are there, that she can count on you. And she also needs stability. Abrupt changes can be frightening for her at this moment." Richard nodded, absorbing every word. He had been researching childhood trauma for the past few nights, reading everything he could find on his phone while Helen slept. He wanted to understand, wanted to know how to help his daughter in the best way possible. His phone vibrated. It was Albert again. Since the evidence was presented to the authorities, his lawyer had been calling several times a day with updates. "Richard, we have news. Marianne and Frederick were arrested an hour ago. They tried to leave town but were intercepted on the interstate. They are now in custody." Richard felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. "So they're not getting away?" "No. And there's more. The police found some interesting documents at the house. It seems Marianne and Frederick had been planning this for months. There were notes about your routine, about the times Helen was alone, about the security cameras. They knew exactly where there was surveillance and where there wasn't. So it was all calculated. Every detail." "Exactly. And about Marianne's pregnancy. We did a DNA test with a sample we legally obtained through her private doctor. The child is not yours, Richard. It's Frederick's." Richard closed his eyes, feeling a wave of disgust. Marianne and Frederick, siblings, romantically involved, and using an innocent child as a pawn in their sick game of greed. "They will pay for this," Richard said, his voice low but filled with determination. "They will. The prosecutor's office is building a solid case. With the evidence we have, it's very likely they'll get severe sentences. And as for the divorce, I'm speeding up the process. Considering the circumstances, there shouldn't be any complications. And the ranch? The businesses? Everything is being handled. The power of attorney has been revoked, and all shared assets are being separated. Marianne won't see a cent of what's yours. And Frederick, well, he never had any right to anything in the first place." After hanging up, Richard returned to Helen's room. The girl was awake, looking out the window with a distant expression. When she saw her father, her face lit up a little. "Daddy, when are we going home?" "Soon, my love. The doctors said if you keep improving like this, we can go in a few days. And Aunt Mary, she won't be there, will she?" "No, honey, she won't be there, and she will never be able to get near you again. Daddy has made sure of that." Helen seemed relieved, but there was still fear in her eyes. "And Uncle Frederick?" "Not him, either. They are both far away from us now, and they will stay away forever. Good, because I don't want to see them ever again. They are bad people, Daddy. Very bad people." Richard sat on the edge of the bed, taking his daughter's hand. "I know, my love. And I'm so sorry I didn't realize it sooner. I'm sorry I let them into our lives and for not seeing what they really were." "You didn't know, Daddy. They tricked you too. Aunt Mary was always so nice when you were around. But when you left—" Helen stopped, her eyes filling with tears. "When you left, she was different. She would say mean things to me. She said I was spoiled, that you would get tired of me one day, and that she would be the lady of the house. I tried to tell you, but she said you wouldn't believe me." Richard felt his heart break. "I would have believed you, Helen. I will always believe you. And I'm sorry for not paying more attention, for not noticing that you were suffering. You were working so much, Daddy, to give me nice things. I know you did it for me. No matter how much I work, nothing is more important than you, nothing. And from now on, I'm going to be more present. I'm going to pay more attention. I'm going to make sure you always feel safe and loved. I always knew you loved me, Daddy. Even when I was alone in that chair, cold and in pain, I knew you would come for me. I just had to hold on a little longer, and you came. You always come when I need you." Tears rolled down Richard's face. He hugged his daughter carefully, feeling her snuggle against him. At that moment he made a silent promise. No matter what it cost, no matter how long it took, He would ensure that Helen had the best life possible, that she could grow up happy, safe, and never have to go through something like this again. In the following days, Helen continued to improve. Physically, she was almost ready to be discharged. Emotionally, there was still a long way to go, but Dr. Sutton was optimistic. With the right treatment and her father's support, she believed Helen could overcome the trauma. Richard began to make plans for when they returned home. He had already fired all the employees who were working at the time of the incident, not because he suspected them, but because he wanted a fresh start. He would hire new people, people he could trust completely. He also planned to make some renovations to the house, changing Helen's room to a more cheerful and secure one, installing more security cameras, and ensuring she always felt protected. Albert continued to work tirelessly on the case. The preliminary hearings were already scheduled and the media had started to pick up the story. Richard tried to keep Helen away from the news, but it was impossible to avoid it completely. The scandal of a wife and her brother trying to harm a stepdaughter for inheritance reasons was a headline in all the local papers. Some of Richard's acquaintances from the equestrian world began to call, offering support and apologizing for not having noticed anything. Richard thanked them politely but kept his distance. He had learned the hard way that he couldn't trust anyone blindly. His priority now was Helen, and anyone in their lives would have to earn his trust slowly. One afternoon, while Helen was taking a nap, Richard went out for a coffee and to stretch his legs. In the hallway he found Mr. Jenkins, the ranch's caretaker. The old man had been there for a few hours, waiting patiently to speak with him. "Mr. Richard," the old man said, respectfully taking off his hat, "I needed to talk to you." "Mr. Jenkins, what are you doing here?" "I came to see how the little girl is doing, and also—" The old man hesitated, his eyes full of guilt. "I wanted to apologize, boss. I should have noticed, I should have seen that something was wrong. It's not your fault, Mr. Jenkins. None of us saw it, they were very careful. But I saw strange things, you know. I saw Mrs. Marianne and Frederick talking secretly several times. I saw how quiet little Helen was around them. But I thought it wasn't my business. I thought it was family stuff. If I had said something—" Richard placed a hand on the old man's shoulder. "Don't blame yourself. The important thing now is that Helen is safe, and that they will pay for what they did." Mr. Jenkins nodded, still looking troubled. "The ranch isn't the same without the little girl, boss. Everyone misses her. When is she coming back?" "Soon. And Mr. Jenkins, I'd like you to continue working with us. You're one of the few people I still trust." The old man was moved. "You can count on me, Mr. Richard. I'll take care of the ranch as if it were my own. And when the little girl comes back, I'll make sure she feels at home." After Mr. Jenkins left, Richard stood thinking. The ranch really wasn't the same anymore. It was tainted by the memories of what happened there. Perhaps in the future they would need a fresh start somewhere else. But for now it was their home, and Richard would do whatever it took to make it a safe and happy place for Helen again. When he returned to the room, Helen was awake and talking animatedly with a nurse about the ranch's horses. Seeing his daughter like this, with a little life returning to her eyes, filled Richard with hope. The road ahead would be difficult, but they would make it. Together, they would overcome all of this and come out stronger on the other side. Chapter 5. A week after the incident, Helen was finally discharged from the hospital. Richard carefully prepared everything for her return to St. Helena's ranch, transforming her room into an even more welcoming and secure space. There were new toys, colorful curtains with flower prints, and a new, more comfortable bed. He also installed an intercom system so Helen could call him at any time, even during the night. The journey back home was quiet. Helen looked out the pickup truck window, watching the familiar landscapes pass by. Richard noticed she flinched a little when they passed through the ranch gate, her little hands gripping the seatbelt tightly. "It's okay, my love, you're safe. Daddy's here," he said softly. Helen nodded, but her eyes remained wide, attentive to every detail. When they arrived at the main house, she hesitated before getting out of the truck. Richard waited patiently, without forcing her. Finally, Helen took a deep breath and opened the door. "I can carry you if you want," he offered. "No, Daddy. I can walk. I just need to go slow because of my leg." With the help of crutches the hospital had provided, Helen entered the house. Mr. Jenkins and some of the new staff were waiting in the living room, all with warm smiles and kind words. They had prepared a small welcome cake, and the house was decorated with balloons and colorful ribbons. "Welcome back, little Helen," Mr. Jenkins said with an emotional voice. "The ranch wasn't the same without you." Helen smiled shyly, clearly touched by the reception. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. I missed everyone, too." Richard helped her up the stairs, and when Helen saw her renovated room, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "Daddy, it's so beautiful you did all this for me. I wanted you to feel special. Because you are special, my love. The most special girl in the world." That night, when it was time for bed, Helen became visibly nervous. Richard realized she didn't want to be alone, even though he was in the room next door. "Do you want me to stay here until you fall asleep?" he asked. "Can you sleep here with me? Just for tonight. Tomorrow I'll try to sleep alone, I promise." Richard didn't hesitate. "It can be tonight, tomorrow, and every day you need. Don't be ashamed to ask, okay? That's what Daddy is here for." He settled into the new armchair he had placed in the room, and Helen finally relaxed enough to close her eyes. But sleep didn't come easily. She woke up several times during the night with nightmares, calling for her father in a panic. Each time, Richard was there, holding her hand, calming her until she could fall back asleep. The following days were about adjustment. Helen began her regular sessions with Dr. Sutton, who now came to the ranch 3 times a week. The sessions were held in a special room Richard had prepared, filled with toys and art supplies so Helen could express herself in different ways. She also started physical therapy to fully recover the movement in her leg. The physical therapist, a young man named Lucas, had a special way with children and managed to make Helen laugh even during the most painful exercises. But despite the physical progress, Richard noticed that Helen was still emotionally fragile. She avoided passing near the riding ring where the accident happened. She refused to see Tornado or any other horse, and she had anxiety attacks whenever she heard an unexpected noise or saw someone who remotely resembled Marianne or Frederick. One afternoon, while Helen was resting after a physical therapy session, Albert arrived at the ranch with news about the case. "The preliminary hearings have begun, Richard, and it's not going well for Marianne and Frederick. The judge is taking the case very seriously." "Good. They deserve everything they're facing and more." "There's something you need to know. Marianne is trying to claim it was all Frederick's idea. She says she was coerced, that she was afraid of him. She's trying to minimize her role in everything." Richard felt the anger rise. "But we have the videos. It's clear she was involved. From the beginning." "Yes, and the prosecution is using that, but her lawyer is good. He's trying to create a victim narrative. They're also using the pregnancy as a mitigating factor, claiming she was under hormonal stress." "That's ridiculous. She planned to hurt a child. Nothing justifies that." "I completely agree, and the judge seems to think the same. But I wanted to warn you. They will try everything. Their lawyer has already indicated that he may call Helen to testify." Richard felt his blood run cold. "No way, she's been through enough trauma. I won't let her be interrogated by aggressive lawyers trying to discredit her. I'll do everything I can to prevent it. But if it's absolutely necessary, we can request that the testimony be given in a protected manner, with only the judge present and you by her side. No direct confrontation. Do that. And Albert, I want you to sue them civilly, too. For moral damages, for everything. I want them to pay in every possible way. I'm already preparing it. We'll hit them on all fronts." After Albert left, Richard thought about everything. The legal process would be long and draining. But there was no alternative. They needed justice. Helen needed to know that the people who hurt her would be held accountable for their actions. That evening at dinner, Helen was quieter than usual. Richard noticed she was picking at her food without really eating. "What's wrong, my love? Not hungry?" "Daddy," Helen began hesitantly, "what's going to happen to Aunt Mary and Uncle Frederick?" Richard put his fork down, giving his daughter his full attention. "They're going to have to answer for what they did. They'll go through a trial, and if they're found guilty, there will be serious consequences." "Will they go to prison?" Possibly, yes, for a long time. Helen was silent for a moment, processing the information. That's right, because they did a very bad thing. To a child. To me. That's very right. And you don't need to feel bad about it. None of this is your fault. They made bad decisions and now they have to face the consequences. I don't feel bad for them, Daddy. Helen stopped, her eyes filling with tears. I'm just scared they'll come back, that they'll find me and do bad things again. Richard got up and went to her, kneeling beside her chair. Look at me, Helen. They will never get near you again, never. Daddy will make sure of that. We have new security at the ranch, cameras everywhere, and even if they were released, which they won't be anytime soon, there are legal measures that prevent them from approaching us. You are safe, I promise. Helen hugged her father tightly. I trust you, Daddy. You always protect me. And I always will. Always. In the following days, Richard focused on creating stable routines for Helen. They had fixed times for meals, for therapy sessions, for playtime. The predictability helped Helen feel more secure. She started to show interest in activities she enjoyed before the incident, like drawing and listening to stories. One morning, while they were having breakfast on the front porch, far from the scene of the accident, Helen surprised Richard with a question. Daddy, do you think I'll ever be able to ride a horse again? Richard put his coffee cup down, choosing his words carefully. Only if you want to, my love. There's no rush. And if you decide you never want to ride again, that's okay too. There's nothing wrong with being afraid after what happened. But I loved riding so much before that happened, and it wasn't Tornado's fault. He just got scared. Helen paused, her eyes filling with tears. Do you think he's mad at me? Of course not, honey. Tornado loves you, and he was scared too by what Frederick did. But there's no hurry at all. When and if you want to see him again, we'll do it slowly, at your own pace. Helen nodded, seeming relieved by her father's answer. Richard realized this was an important step in her recovery. She was beginning to separate the trauma from the activity she loved. It was a slow process, but it was progress. In the afternoon, Dr. Sutton arrived for another session. Afterward, she called Richard to talk privately. Helen is making significant progress. She's starting to process the trauma in a healthy way, expressing her fears and working through them. But there's something that worries me. What is it? Richard asked, immediately alert. She's holding on to a lot of anger. Anger at Marianne, at Frederick, and also at herself for not being able to stop what happened. This anger is natural and expected, but it needs to be worked through. Otherwise, it can turn into something more destructive in the future. What can I do to help? Continue to be patient and present. Let her express that anger in healthy ways. If she wants to scream, hit pillows, draw things that represent her anger, let her. It's part of the healing process. And make sure she knows that you won't judge or reprimand these feelings. I'll do that. Anything it takes to help her. You're doing an excellent job, Mr. Thompson. Many parents don't have the patience and dedication you've shown. Helen is lucky to have you. Richard felt a pang in his heart. No, Doctor. I'm the one who's lucky to have her. She's stronger and braver than many adults I know, and I will do everything to honor that strength, to help her grow up knowing she can overcome anything. That night, as he tucked Helen into bed, Richard looked at his daughter and saw not just the traumatized child she had become, but also the incredible person she was striving to be again, and he knew, with absolute certainty, that they were going to make it, no matter how long it took, no matter how difficult the path. Together they would overcome all of this and find happiness again. Chapter 6. 3 weeks had passed since Helen returned home, and the routine at St. Helena's Ranch had settled into a new normal. Therapy sessions continued regularly, and Helen showed consistent progress. Her leg was healing well, and she could already walk without crutches, though with a slight limp that the doctors said would disappear over time. Richard had drastically reduced his business trips, delegating more responsibilities to his managers and conducting most meetings via video conference. His priority now was to be present for Helen, and he didn't regret this decision one bit. Money was important, but nothing compared to the value of seeing his daughter recover and knowing he was there for her. One Saturday morning, While they were having coffee on the porch, Helen made a request that surprised Richard. "Daddy, I want to see Tornado." Richard looked up from his coffee cup, watching his daughter carefully. "Are you sure, my love? There's no rush. We can wait a little longer if you're not ready." "I know, but I dreamed about him last night. I dreamed he was sad because he thought I didn't like him anymore. And I realized that I miss him. Tornado, not the other people." Richard understood perfectly. "All right, we can go see him. But let's take it slow, okay? If at any moment you want to go back, just tell me." "Okay, Daddy." After breakfast, they walked slowly towards the stables. Helen held her father's hand tightly, her breathing becoming faster as they got closer. When they reached the stable where Tornado was kept, she stopped, hesitant. "We can go back," Richard suggested gently. "No, I want to do this. I just need a minute." Richard waited, patiently, as Helen took several deep breaths, preparing herself. Finally, she took a step forward, and then another. When she reached Tornado's stall, the pony immediately approached, neighing softly and pushing his muzzle against the bars. Helen extended a trembling hand and touched the animal's muzzle. Tornado gently nudged her hand, as he always did when he wanted affection. Helen's eyes filled with tears. "Hi, Tornado. I'm sorry I stayed away for so long. I wasn't mad at you. I was just scared." The pony shook his head as if he understood, and Helen finally let the tears roll. Richard stood beside her, a hand on her shoulder, offering silent support as she processed her emotions. "It wasn't his fault, Daddy. Uncle Frederick hurt him too. He made him scared to throw me on the ground. Tornado would never do that on his own." "I know, honey. And Tornado knows you understand that. Look how happy he is to see you." Helen spent the next 20 minutes talking to the pony, telling him about her leg, about the hospital, about how much she missed him. Richard watched, realizing that this was a crucial moment in his daughter's emotional recovery. She was facing her fears, confronting the trauma, and reclaiming something that had been taken from her. When they finally left the stable, Helen seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. "Daddy, I think one day I'll want to ride again. Not now, but one day, when I'm ready." "When you're ready, my love. And it won't be in this riding ring. We'll build a new one, somewhere else, a place with no bad memories." "Can it be near the house so you can see, so I know you're watching?" "It can be. Wherever you want, honey." That afternoon, Albert called with an important update on the case. "Richard, the trial date has been set. It will be in 6 weeks, and I have good news and bad news." Start with the bad. Marianne's lawyer managed to get the request for Helen's testimony approved. The judge agreed, but with all the protections we asked for. It will be in a closed chamber. Just the judge, the prosecutor, one defense attorney, and you present. No Marianne or Frederick in the room. Richard sighed. "I knew this would happen. How am I going to prepare Helen for this?" "Dr. Sutton can help. She can do preparatory sessions with Helen, teaching her how to handle difficult questions and stay calm, and I'll be there too, making sure no one pressures her too much." "And the good news?" "The prosecutor is very confident. With the video evidence, the doctor's testimony about Helen's injuries, and the documentary evidence we found about the planning, he believes we'll get severe sentences for both of them. We've also managed to freeze all of Marianne's assets. She won't see a cent of what you built together." "And what about her pregnancy? The baby?" "She gave birth a few days ago, a boy. He's been placed in temporary state custody until a decision is made. Considering he's the child of siblings and both parents will likely be in prison, the tendency is for him to be placed for adoption." Richard felt a pang of something he couldn't identify. It wasn't exactly pity, but a sadness for the baby who was not at fault, born from such a sordid situation. "The baby is not to blame for his parents' problems," Richard commented. "He's not. And the state will ensure he is placed in a suitable home. You don't need to worry about that." After hanging up, Richard thought about how he would tell Helen about the testimony. She was progressing so well, and the idea of having to relive the trauma in court was disturbing, but it was necessary, and he would be there by her side every step of the way. That night after dinner, Richard sat with Helen in the living room. My love, I need to talk to you about something important. Helen immediately tensed, her eyes widening. What is it, Daddy? Is Aunt Mary getting out? No, nothing like that. But... Richard took a deep breath. Remember I told you about the trial, about how Aunt Mary and Uncle Frederick will have to answer for what they did. I remember. The judge will need to hear from you. You'll have to tell him what happened. But don't worry, it will be in a small room only with people you can trust. I'll be there with you the whole time, and Dr. Sutton will help you prepare. Will I have to see them, Aunt Mary and Uncle Frederick? No. They won't be in the room. You'll just talk to the judge and answer some questions, and if it gets too hard, we'll stop and take a break, okay? Helen was quiet for a long moment, processing the information. Finally, she asked in a low voice, Do I have to do this, Daddy? Is there no other way? Unfortunately, no, but you are very brave, and it will be all right. Daddy promises to be there to protect you. Okay? If it's for them to pay for what they did, I'll do it, because I don't want them to hurt other children. Richard hugged his daughter tightly, moved by her courage. You're amazing, Helen, the bravest girl I know. In the following weeks, Dr. Sutton began the preparatory sessions with Helen. They practiced possible questions and answers, worked on breathing techniques for moments of anxiety, and discussed what to expect from the courtroom environment. Helen proved to be surprisingly resilient, determined to do her part to ensure justice was served. Richard also prepared himself, talking at length with Albert about the process, what to expect, and how to best support Helen. He was nervous but also determined. They had come so far. They weren't going to give up now. One night, 2 weeks before the trial, Helen had one of the worst nightmares since she had returned from the hospital. She woke up screaming, calling for her father in a panic. Richard ran to her room and found her sitting up in bed, trembling violently. It's okay, my love. It was just a dream. You're safe. But Helen couldn't calm down. It was Aunt Mary. She was here in my room. She said she was going to hurt me again. She said you wouldn't be able to protect me this time. It was just a dream, honey. She's not here. She can't get near you. Look around. It's just you and me here. Helen looked around the room, her eyes gradually returning to normal. She threw herself into her father's arms, crying uncontrollably. Richard held her tightly, murmuring reassuring words as he rocked her gently. I'll sleep here with you tonight, okay? So you know you're safe. Daddy won't let anything bad happen to you. Promise? I promise, my love. With my whole life. I promise. Richard spent the night in the armchair in Helen's room, waking up at every sound to make sure she was sleeping peacefully. That night, he made a silent promise to himself. No matter what happened at the trial, no matter how long it took for Helen to fully recover, he would be there, always. Because that's what a father does. He protects, he loves, and he gives his daughter all the support she needs to face any storm life brings. Chapter 7. Screams echoed through the hall as the images showed Isabella falling from the horse and hitting her head on the rock. Several women covered their mouths with their hands, horrified. Men stood up from their chairs in disbelief. The scene was too brutal, impossible, to watch without feeling one's stomach turn. A small, defenseless child being deliberately put in a dangerous situation by 2 adults who should have been taking care of her. Richard let the images speak for themselves. He didn't need to narrate, didn't need to add dramatic commentary. The truth exposed there was powerful enough. The video then showed Marcus and Julia carrying an unconscious Isabella, putting her in the wheelchair, leaving her on the outside porch as the rain began to fall. The last scene showed the two simply walking away, abandoning the injured and helpless girl. When the lights in the hall came back on, the silence was absolute. All the hundreds of people present were in a state of shock, processing what they had just seen. Julia was standing, trembling, her hands gripping the table in front of her, as if she were about to faint. Her face was as white as paper, and tears of panic streamed down her cheeks, smudging her carefully applied makeup. Richard continued from the stage, his voice now colder, harder. He explained that he had all the necessary evidence in hand. Not just the recordings, but also medical reports, witness statements, and Even Isabella's own confession, recorded by the psychologist treating her, with permission and under all appropriate legal protocols. He wasn't there to make frivolous accusations or to seek personal revenge. He was there to ensure the truth was known and that his daughter was protected. Then Richard revealed another devastating detail. With the help of Dr. Renner, he had discovered that Julia and Marcus had been having an affair for months, and even more shockingly, Julia was pregnant with Marcus's child. The motive behind the attack on Isabella was clear: greed and ambition. If the girl were out of the way, Julia would inherit all of Richard's fortune. She planned to divorce him, take the money and live with Marcus. The audience erupted in indignant murmurs. Some people shouted insults at Julia. Others simply stood paralyzed in shock. Cell phone cameras began to flash throughout the hall as guests recorded the historic moment. The media present, who had come to cover a routine social event, suddenly found themselves in the middle of the biggest scandal of the year. Julia finally found her voice. She screamed that it was all a lie, that Richard was making up the story because he wanted to divorce her and didn't want to divide their assets. She said the recordings were fake, manipulated, that she would never harm Isabella. Her voice was hysterical, desperate, and no one in the hall seemed to believe her. The evidence was too clear, too brutal to be contested. It was then that something happened that not even Richard expected. Marcus, who no one knew was present at the event, suddenly stood up from a table at the back of the hall. He had entered discreetly during dinner, apparently to confront Richard or perhaps to warn Julia, but now, faced with the complete public exposure of his actions, he was panicking. Marcus started shouting too, trying to defend himself. He said it was Julia's idea, that she had convinced him, that he didn't want to hurt Isabella, but was desperate because of his debts. He blamed Julia for everything, saying she had manipulated him, promised they would get rich if he helped. The words tumbled out of his mouth, a complete admission of guilt disguised as an attempt to redeem himself. Julia turned to Marcus with an expression of fury and betrayal. She began to shout back, saying he was a coward, that he was trying to put all the blame on her when he had been the one who suggested using the horse, who said it would be the perfect method, because it would look like an accident. The two began to accuse each other, each trying to shift the responsibility to the other, completely forgetting where they were and who was listening. Richard watched everything from the stage with a look of deep disgust. He felt no satisfaction in seeing this. He felt no pleasure in exposing the two of them in this way. He only felt an immense sadness that his family, the life he had built, had been destroyed by these two people he had trusted. But he also felt a tremendous relief that the truth was finally out, that Isabella would be safe now, that no one would ever doubt what had happened. The president of the association came up on stage, visibly shaken. He asked the audience for calm and announced that the authorities had already been contacted and were on their way. He expressed solidarity with Richard and said the association would offer all necessary support. Then he asked Richard to come down from the stage and go take care of his daughter, that the event was over given the circumstances. Richard came down, and as he walked towards the exit, dozens of people approached him, touching his shoulder, expressing support, saying they were shocked, that they would do whatever was necessary to help. He thanked them mechanically, his mind already elsewhere, already thinking about Isabella, about how to ensure she would never have to worry about those two people again. Outside the hall he found Dr. Renner waiting with two investigators and a representative from the state police, whom the lawyer had contacted previously. Richard handed over all the physical evidence he had brought, copies of the videos on flash drives, medical reports, written statements. The officer assured him that an investigation would be opened immediately, that Julia and Marcus would be formally questioned, and that protective measures for Isabella would be implemented. Richard drove home on autopilot, his mind empty of thoughts. When he arrived at the ranch, he went straight to the house where Isabella was. The girl was sleeping, but she woke up when she sensed her father's presence. She smiled sleepily and asked how the event had been. Richard sat beside her, held her small hand, and simply said that everything had gone well, that she was safe now, that she would never have to be afraid again. Isabella seemed to understand more than he said explicitly. She hugged her father and whispered a thank you so sincere and full of emotion that Richard felt the tears finally escape. He cried there, holding his daughter, releasing all the tension, all the stress, all the anger and sadness accumulated over the past weeks. And Isabella, despite being only 7, was the one who comforted her father, stroking his hair and saying that it was okay, that they would be okay. In the following weeks, the story spread throughout the country. The videos of the exposure at the ball went viral on social media. Julia and Marcus became symbols of betrayal and cruelty. The media covered the case extensively, and while some outlets tried to sensationalize it, most treated it with the seriousness it deserved, focusing on Richard's courage in exposing the truth and Isabella's resilience. Julia tried to sue Richard for defamation and moral damages, but her lawyer dropped the case when he saw the complete evidence. There was simply no possible defense. The recordings were irrefutable, and the public admissions she and Marcus made during the confrontation at the ball were all recorded by dozens of cell phones. Instead of suing, Julia ended up having to defend herself against multiple charges: gross negligence of a minor, coercion, marital fraud. Marcus, for his part, tried to make a deal with the authorities, offering a full testimony in exchange for a lighter sentence. He confirmed everything Richard had discovered: the affair with Julia, the pregnancy, the plan to inherit the fortune, the idea of using the horse to create an accident that would seem natural. His statements only strengthened the case against Julia. The divorce process was quick and final. Richard wanted nothing from Julia, asked for no compensation for moral damages, sought no financial revenge. He just wanted her out of their lives. The judge granted the divorce in record time, considering the extraordinary circumstances of the case. Julia had to return all the jewelry and expensive goods Richard had given her during the marriage, but most importantly, she lost any rights to the property, the businesses, or even visitation with Isabella. The girl was officially declared to be under threat, and a restraining order was issued against Julia and Marcus. They could not come within 500 yards of Isabella, under penalty of prosecution. For Richard, this was more important than any legal punishment. Isabella was safe. Finally, truly safe. Chapter 8. The following months were a time of rebuilding. For Richard, it meant learning to balance his time between business and being the present father Isabella needed. He hired a trusted administrative manager to handle the daily operations of the stud farm, freeing him up to spend more time with his daughter. These were months of mutual learning, of discoveries, of celebrating small victories and overcoming difficult moments together. For Isabella, it meant a long process of physical and emotional healing, overcoming the traumas that had been imposed on her by people who should have protected her. Each day brought new challenges, but also new progress. It was a journey of 2 steps forward, and sometimes 1 step back, but always moving forward, always growing. Isabella's physical recovery progressed better than the doctors initially expected. The broken leg healed well, thanks to regular physical therapy sessions with the therapist Marcia, a dedicated professional who managed to make the exercises seem like games. After 3 months of intensive physical therapy, Isabella could already walk without assistance, albeit with a slight limp that would likely disappear over time. Marcia said the girl was one of the most determined patients she had ever treated, always pushing herself beyond what was necessary, always wanting to improve. The head wound healed without leaving visible scars, although the hair had not yet fully grown back in the spot where the stitches were. Richard always made sure to tell Isabella that this small mark was a symbol of her strength, of her survival, something she should be proud of and not ashamed of. The emotional recovery was more complex and challenging. Isabella continued to have occasional nightmares, especially on rainy nights, when the memories of that terrible day came back with full force. On those nights, Richard slept with his bedroom door ajar, always alert to any sign that his daughter needed him. Several times he woke up to her muffled screams and ran to comfort her, holding her until the tremors stopped, until she began to breathe normally again. She developed an intense fear of horses, which was understandable but painful for Richard, who had always dreamed of one day sharing his passion for these animals with his daughter. In the first few months, Isabella couldn't even look in the direction of the stables without her heart racing and her hands getting sweaty. The mere sound of a distant neigh would make her freeze, her eyes wide with panic. Dr. Fernanda Souza, the psychologist who was seeing Isabella, was a woman in her 40s with a warm and comforting presence. She had decades of experience working with traumatized children and knew exactly how to approach each stage of the healing process. She explained to Richard that Isabella's fear of horses might never completely disappear, but that with proper therapy and patience, the girl could learn to manage it, to transform it from a paralyzing terror into a controllable apprehension. The therapy sessions took place 3 times a week at Dr. Souza's office in Frankfurt. Richard always took Isabella personally, and while he waited in the waiting room, he would flip through magazines without really reading, his mind always on what was happening on the other side of that door. Sometimes, through the walls, he could hear the psychologist's gentle voice asking questions, and occasionally Isabella's restrained sobs when a particularly painful memory was addressed. But there was notable progress that filled Richard's heart with hope. Isabella started smiling frequently again, that wide, genuine smile that lit up her entire face. She started playing with Thor in the garden again, throwing the ball for the tireless dog who never seemed to tire of fetching. She started watching her favorite cartoons again, especially those about brave princesses and magical adventures. When it was time to go back to school, Richard was nervous, worried about how Isabella would react to the environment full of noisy children and the demanding routine. But his daughter surprised him. On the first day, she woke up early, excited to see her friends again, to use the new backpack Richard had bought for her, decorated with sparkling stars. She was received with immense affection by teachers and classmates. The principal, Mrs. Paula, an experienced educator, whom Richard had met personally to explain the situation, had prepared the entire staff. The teachers were instructed to be sensitive, but not overprotective, to treat Isabella normally but to be attentive to any sign of difficulty. The classmates, in the typical innocence of children, were simply happy to have their friend back. They made welcome-back drawings, shared their snacks, and included Isabella in all the recess games, adapting them when necessary because of her still recovering leg. The school also offered additional psychological support through its school psychologist, who coordinated with Dr. Souza to ensure Isabella had all the necessary support. Richard was grateful every day for that support network, for all those people who genuinely cared about his daughter's well-being. One of the most touching moments in Isabella's recovery happened about 4 months after the incident. It was a sunny Saturday in February, with a cloudless blue sky. Richard had taken his daughter for a picnic in a quiet area of the ranch, far from the stables, but still with a beautiful view of the property. He had carefully chosen the spot, under the shade of a huge blooming yellow trumpet tree, its golden flowers creating a natural canopy above them. They were sitting on a blue and white checkered blanket, eating cheese and ham sandwiches that Richard had prepared, accompanied by fresh orange juice. Thor lay beside them, occasionally receiving small pieces of bread from Isabella's generous hands. The gentle wind swayed the flowers of the tree, causing some petals to fall on them like golden rain. It was a moment of perfect peace, so different from the chaos and pain of the previous months. They were talking about light subjects, about Isabella's friends at school, about the new book she was reading, about plans for the summer vacation. Richard made sure to keep the conversations normal, not to constantly focus on the trauma, to allow Isabella's life to be more than just her recovery. But then, suddenly, Isabella became serious. She stopped eating her sandwich, placed it carefully on the paper plate, and fixed her eyes on her father. Richard recognized that expression, knew that something important was coming. He put his own sandwich aside and gave his daughter his full attention. Isabella asked her father, in a small but firm voice, if he was sad because Julia had gone away. The question caught Richard by surprise. He didn't expect Isabella to be thinking about that, didn't expect her to be worried about his feelings regarding his ex-wife. He took a deep breath, choosing his words carefully, wanting to be honest but also comforting. Richard replied that no, he was actually relieved. He explained in terms a 7-year-old could understand, that sometimes people are not who they seem to be, and that when we discover the truth, although it hurts at first, it's better than living a lie. He said that now they could be a real family, just the two of them, without lies or people pretending to care. That it was a smaller family, but it was real, authentic, built on true love. Isabella thought for a long moment, her eyes fixed on an ant carrying a breadcrumb across the ground. Richard could almost see the thoughts forming in her young mind, processing complex concepts of betrayal, family, and love. Then she said something that made Richard's heart ache with a mixture of sadness and pride. She said she missed having a mother, but she had never really felt that Julia was her mother. Her stepmother was always distant, always seemed to be thinking about other things when she was with Isabella. The girl said that her real mother, the one she barely remembered but felt in her heart, was different. She was affectionate, present, made her feel safe. And that now, with her daddy taking care of her every day, she finally felt safe again. Richard hugged his daughter, struggling to hold back the tears. He promised he would always be there for her, that nothing in the world was more important than Isabella's happiness and safety, and that one day, when she was ready, he would tell her more stories about her mother, about how much that incredible woman had loved her in the few years they had together. The ranch continued to prosper in ways Richard hadn't anticipated. In a way, the scandal had brought unexpected publicity to Green Valley Stud, but it wasn't the sensationalist kind he had feared. Many people admired Richard's courage in exposing the truth, in prioritizing his daughter's safety above all else. He became a respected figure not only as a businessman, but as a father and a person of character. Several new clients sought his services, explicitly saying they wanted to support a man who had shown such integrity. Businessmen from Louisville, from Cincinnati, even from other states, began sending their horses to be trained at Green Valley. The competitions the stud's animals participated in began to bring in more frequent prizes, further elevating the property's reputation. Richard used some of the extra profits to create the Isabella Institute, a fund to support children who were victims of neglect and difficult situations. The Institute offered free psychological support, legal assistance for families in complicated situations, and educational programs. It was a way to transform personal tragedy into something positive for society, to ensure that Isabella's suffering had a greater purpose, helping other children find safety and healing. Mr. Anthony, the loyal foreman who had been with the family for over 20 years, became an even more present and important figure in the lives of Richard and Isabella. The man took on an almost avuncular role, visiting Isabella regularly not just during work hours, but on weekends as well. He brought small, carefully chosen gifts, a coloring book, a puzzle, wildflowers he picked from the ranch's fields. He told funny stories that made the girl laugh, that crystal-clear child's laugh that is one of the most beautiful sounds in the world. His wife, Mrs. Mary, a robust woman in her 50s with a heart even bigger than her warm smile, began to prepare special meals for Richard and Isabella. She would appear at the main house a few times a week with glass jars full of homemade food, chili, chicken and dumplings, still warm biscuits, creamy caramel sauce. They were dishes that reminded Richard of the food his mother used to make when he was a child, flavors of love and care that cannot be replicated in any restaurant. As for Julia and Marcus, their lives completely fell apart after the public exposure. Julia had the baby, a boy born healthy in a public hospital in Cincinnati. But just 3 months after his birth, based on the evidence from the case and psychological evaluations, she lost custody. The judge determined that she had neither the emotional nor moral capacity to raise a child. The small child was handed over to Marcus's parents, grandparents who at least had some sense of decency and responsibility, and who had no part in their son's horrible actions. Julia went back to live with her mother, Mrs. Carmen, in a small 2-bedroom apartment in a simple Cincinnati neighborhood. The woman who once frequented expensive boutiques and dined in sophisticated restaurants now worked temporary jobs, taking whatever she could find. Her reputation was completely destroyed. Old friends avoided her. Acquaintances crossed the street when they saw her. Her name had become synonymous with betrayal and cruelty, and there was no escaping it in an age of internet and social media. Marcus, for his part, managed a plea deal where he fully confessed his participation in the events. In exchange for his full cooperation and the detailed testimony he provided to the authorities, he received a sentence of extensive community service and mandatory psychological counseling for 5 years. He lost the right to see his son until he proved, through years of therapy and exemplary behavior, that he was rehabilitated and fit to be a father. The last news Richard had of him, through the private investigator who still maintained some discreet surveillance, was that Marcus was working in an auto parts store in a small town in rural Kentucky near Bardstown. He was trying to rebuild his life away from the spotlight, using a nickname, avoiding any mention of his past. His debts still haunted him, and he lived modestly in a boarding house, slowly paying off what he owed. Richard felt no pity for either of them, nor did he feel anger. What he felt was a deep gratitude for having discovered the truth in time, for having saved his daughter from a much worse fate. And he felt hope for the future that he and Isabella could build together. Life on the ranch settled into a new, healthy, and comforting routine. Richard drastically reduced his business trips, delegating more responsibilities to trusted managers he had personally trained. He spent his mornings working in the administrative office, dealing with paperwork, making important calls, planning strategies for the stud farm. But always, without exception, he stopped everything at noon to have lunch with Isabella. These lunches were sacred. They talked about the day, about what Isabella was learning. At school, about her friends, about plans for the afternoon. Richard made sure to be present, to really listen, to ask questions that showed genuine interest in his daughter's life. It wasn't just sitting at the table together, it was connecting, building memories, strengthening the bond that united them. The afternoons were dedicated to activities together, varying according to Isabella's mood and interests. Some afternoons were for art classes, where Richard would sit next to his daughter and try, without much success but with great enthusiasm, to paint his own works. Others were reading sessions, where they would curl up on the living room sofa, and Richard would read aloud while Isabella followed the words in the book, sometimes falling asleep against her father's shoulder. There were afternoons of playing in the garden, of fetch with Thor, of hide and seek behind the trees, and there were also the cooking lessons, where father and daughter would try, with varying success and many laughs, to prepare new recipes Isabella found in children's cookbooks. Isabella developed a special and deep interest in drawing and painting. Dr. Souza explained that it was common and even therapeutic for children who had gone through trauma to express their emotions through art. Artistic creation allowed Isabella to process complex feelings she might not be able to verbalize, giving visual form to fears, hopes, joys, and sorrows. Richard, always attentive to his daughter's needs, transformed one of the rooms in the house into a real studio for Isabella. He bought easels of different sizes, suitable for a child. He filled cabinets with paints of all colors and types: watercolor, acrylic paint, gouache, professional colored pencils, pastel chalks. There were papers of all weights and sizes, from small sketch pads to large stretched canvases. The walls of the studio were covered with cork, where Isabella could hang her works in progress and admire them. The girl would spend hours in that space, completely absorbed in her creation. She created colorful worlds where there was always a bright sun in the sky, where children smiled and played in gardens full of flowers, where golden dogs ran happily. They were scenes of peace, of happiness, of security. Each painting was a silent affirmation that she was healing, that she was rebuilding her inner world in brighter tones. One day, about 6 months after the incident, Isabella created a painting that made Richard stop and really observe the progress she had made. It was a scene of the ranch, but it didn't include horses or stables. Instead, it showed the main house, the flowering garden, and 2 human figures, one large and one small, holding hands under a bright blue sky. Underneath, in carefully formed letters, Isabella had written, "My family." Richard hung that painting on the wall of his office, where he could see it every day. It was a constant reminder of why he had done what he did, of why the truth, however painful to reveal, was always better than living a lie. And it was a symbol of hope that even after the most devastating storm, it was possible to rebuild. It was possible to find joy again. The relationship between father and daughter strengthened in ways Richard never imagined possible when Isabella was born. They developed little rituals that gave structure and security to their days. Every morning, they would wake up early and have breakfast together in the kitchen, where they discussed plans for the day while eating warm toast with butter and drinking freshly squeezed orange juice. Richard always let Isabella choose the fruit she wanted to eat, turning even this small detail into a way of giving her control and autonomy. Before dinner, regardless of the weather or the time of year, they would take a walk around the property. Sometimes it was just a short stroll around the house. Other times they would venture further, exploring corners of the ranch Isabella had never seen. During these walks, they talked about everything and nothing, about the stars that were beginning to appear in the sky, about the wildflowers that grew, about what Isabella wanted to be when she grew up, about their favorite memories of the day. And every night, without exception, Richard read a story to Isabella before bed. Even though she could already read by herself, even if it was a story they had already read 10 times, this ritual continued. There was something comforting in her father's reading voice, in the physical closeness as she snuggled against him, in the predictability of that moment of connection before sleep. Isabella also began to show an interest in helping with the ranch activities, but in ways that didn't involve horses. She loved visiting the organic garden that Richard maintained on the eastern part of the property, where he grew tomatoes, lettuce, carrots, and aromatic herbs. She enjoyed helping Mrs. Mary harvest the vegetables, learning about each plant, about when they were ready for harvest, about how to care for the land. She also loved feeding the chickens that Richard had acquired, which were kept in a spacious coop near the house. Every morning, Isabella would run there with a bucket of corn, laughing as the chickens pecked excitedly around her. These were simple, but deeply significant activities. They made Isabella feel connected to the place, useful, part of something bigger. They helped her transform the ranch from a place associated with trauma into a true home, a place where she was loved, valued, and safe. Richard also began to allow himself to think about the future in ways he had avoided while married to Julia. During that period, he always had a sense of unease when he thought too far ahead, as if something was wrong but he couldn't identify what. He now understood that it was his instinct trying to warn him about the falsity that permeated his marriage. But now, free from those shackles, he could genuinely dream about Isabella's future. He thought about what she wanted to be when she grew up, about what kind of education would be best for her, about the opportunities he could provide. He thought about how to prepare the girl for a world that was not always kind or fair, but without stealing her innocence or her joy. He thought about the values he wanted to impart, about the strength of character he hoped she would develop. But now, unlike before, these thoughts were accompanied by pure hope, not fear or excessive worry. They were the thoughts of a father who genuinely believed in his daughter's bright future. One night, while tucking Isabella into bed, the girl asked if he would ever get married again, if she would have another mother. Richard thought carefully before answering. He said he didn't know what the future held, but if he ever found someone special, it would be someone who loved Isabella as much as he did, someone who would treat her with all the care and respect she deserved. And more importantly, it would be a choice they would make together, father and daughter. Isabella seemed satisfied with the answer. She hugged her father and said that, as long as she had him, she already had everything she needed. Richard kissed her forehead, turned off the light, and left the room with his heart full of a love so intense it almost hurt. Chapter 9. A year after that terrible night when Richard found Isabella injured and abandoned on the porch, life on the ranch had found a new and healthy balance. Isabella's 8th birthday was celebrated with a small but cheerful party, with her school friends, some ranch employees who had become close friends, and lots of chocolate cake, the birthday girl's favorite. The party took place in the garden of the house, decorated with colorful balloons and a table full of sweets and snacks. Isabella wore a yellow dress she had chosen herself, and her face shone with genuine happiness. She played with the other children, laughed without reservation, and at no point did she show the fear or anxiety that used to consume her in the first months after the trauma. Richard had spent weeks planning that party. He wanted it to be special, to mark not only another year of his daughter's life, but also the overcoming of everything they had faced together. He hired a clown who juggled and told jokes that made the children roar with laughter. There was a craft table where the little ones could paint and draw, an activity Isabella particularly loved. And at the center of it all, a three-tiered cake decorated with colorful butterflies, a symbol of transformation and rebirth that Dr. Souza had suggested as a way to celebrate Isabella's healing journey. Richard watched everything from a distance, his heart overflowing with pride and gratitude. His daughter had overcome something that could have destroyed her. She was a survivor, a small but incredibly strong warrior. And he had learned valuable lessons about trust, about vigilance, about the importance of never assuming everything is fine just because it seems to be. As the children played tag in the garden, Richard thought about how this scene would have been impossible to imagine a year ago. Back then, Isabella could barely walk, was terrified of any loud noise, and woke up screaming every night. Now, there she was, running and laughing, her brown hair flying in the wind, her eyes shining with pure, genuine joy. It was a silent miracle, a victory won day by day, therapy session by therapy session, hug by hug. During the party, Mr. Anthony approached Richard with a warm smile. The foreman was wearing his best shirt, the one he reserved for special occasions, and carried a carefully wrapped gift for Isabella. He commented on how the girl had grown and developed over the past year, how wonderful it was to see that transformation. He remembered how, in the first months, Isabella would shrink away at the sight of any man approaching, and now she chatted animatedly with all the ranch employees, always curious, always smiling. Mr. Anthony also mentioned that the entire local community admired Richard for the way he had handled the situation, for his courage in exposing the truth, even when it would have been easier to keep everything secret. He said that at church meetings, in conversations at the town market, Richard's name was always mentioned with respect and admiration. People said he had set a powerful example of integrity and fatherly love. Richard thanked him, but deflected the praise, always uncomfortable with so much attention. He said that any father would have done the same, that protecting his daughter wasn't heroism, it was just love. The least any decent person would do. Mr. Anthony gently disagreed, placing a hand on Richard's shoulder with affection. He explained that many people, when faced with such deep betrayals, choose denial or destructive revenge. Richard had chosen truth and justice, which required a different, more difficult kind of courage. He had chosen the harder path, but also the right one, and that deserved recognition. As the party went on, Richard reflected on all the changes of the past year. The divorce from Julia had been finalized for months. He never had any more contact with her or Marcus, and he preferred it that way. They were no longer part of his life or Isabella's, and that was all that mattered. The legal process had dragged on for some time, but eventually both accepted agreements that kept them permanently away from the Thompson family. Green Valley Stud continued to prosper. Richard had implemented new security protocols throughout the property, not only more advanced cameras, but also additional training for all employees on the safety of minors. He would never again allow something similar to happen, not on his property, not under his watch. Isabella had also made impressive progress in her therapy. Dr. Souza reduced the sessions from 3 times a week to once every 2 weeks, a clear sign that the girl was processing the trauma in a healthy way. She still had occasional nightmares, but they were increasingly rare. And although she maintained a respectful distance from the horses, she no longer showed the paralyzing terror she felt in the first months. In fact, a few days before the party, something remarkable had happened, a moment Richard knew he would cherish forever. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and Isabella was in the garden playing with Thor. The golden retriever had become not just a pet, but a true therapeutic companion for the girl. He seemed to understand with that instinctive wisdom of animals that Isabella needed extra affection and protection. That morning, while throwing a ball for Thor, Isabella suddenly stopped and stood still. Richard, who was watering the nearby plants, immediately became alert. He followed his daughter's gaze and saw what had caught her attention. Star, one of the oldest and gentlest mares on the ranch, was grazing near the fence just a few yards away. Star was 23 years old, retired from racing for over a decade. She was a gentle mare with a silvery grey coat, who now lived her days peacefully eating grass, receiving treats from the staff, and occasionally taking calm rides with experienced visitors. Richard had always had a special affection for that mare, who had been one of the first champions bred at the stud by his father. Isabella stopped playing and watched the animal for a few minutes. Her body was tense, and Richard could see the internal conflict happening, the deep-seated fear fighting against a child's natural curiosity. He watched the scene with his heart in his throat, his hands gripping the watering can tightly, ready to intervene if necessary. But he also knew it was important to let Isabella face her fears at her own pace, without forcing, without rushing. Thor noticed the change in Isabella's behavior and approached her, nudging her hand with his muzzle as if offering support. The girl stroked the dog's head, and that simple gesture seemed to give her courage. Then, to Richard's surprise and deep emotion, Isabella began to walk slowly towards the fence. Each step seemed to require immense effort. Richard could see her little hands trembling slightly, could see the way she took deep breaths with each yard she advanced, but she continued, determined, until she reached the wooden fence that separated the garden from the paddock. Star lifted her head, noticing the girl's presence. The animal calmly chewed a handful of grass, and then, with slow, delicate movements, approached the fence. Isabella extended her hand, hesitant, and stopped it mid-air, as if an invisible barrier prevented her from continuing. Richard saw silent tears begin to stream down his daughter's face, tears of frustration, of fear, of anger at herself, for not being able to simply touch the animal. And then, something extraordinary happened. Star, with that ancient wisdom that horses seem to possess, lowered her head and gently touched her muzzle to Isabella's trembling hand, making the movement the girl couldn't complete. The touch was brief, perhaps only 3 or 4 seconds. Isabella let out a sob mixed with a nervous laugh, her tears now of relief and pride. Star remained there, motionless, as if understanding the importance of that moment. And then Isabella, with a wet smile on her face, gently stroked the mare's muzzle before taking a few steps back. It was just a moment, but for Richard, that moment was monumental, transformative. It was a sign that his daughter was truly healing, that the trauma would not define her life forever, that she could, in her own time and in her own way, overcome what had happened. Richard had to swallow his own tears as he watched Isabella run back to play with Thor, her step lighter, her smile brighter than it had been in months. Now, watching Isabella blow out the candles on her cake while everyone sang "Happy Birthday," Richard felt a peace he hadn't experienced in a long time. Life wasn't perfect, it never would be. There would always be challenges, there would always be difficult times, but they had each other. They had a solid foundation of love and trust, and that was more than enough. After the party, when all the guests had gone and Isabella was taking a bath before bed, Richard sat on the porch of the house, the same porch where he had found his daughter on that terrible night. But now, instead of terror and despair, he felt gratitude and hope. He thought about how life can change in an instant, how the people we trust can betray us, how the darkest moments can test our strength in unimaginable ways. But he also thought about resilience, about unconditional love, about how the truth, however painful, always sets you free. Isabella appeared at the door, already in her pajamas, her hair still damp from the bath. Her bare feet made a soft sound on the wooden floor as she walked to her father. She sat on Richard's lap, snuggling into his arms as she did every night, a ritual they both cherished deeply. Richard hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of the strawberry shampoo she loved, feeling the comforting weight of her small body against his chest. The girl was silent for a few moments, just watching the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Richard could hear her quiet breathing, feel the beat of her heart. It was in these moments of stillness that he was most grateful for all they had achieved, for every day Isabella woke up smiling, for every night she slept in peace. Finally, Isabella broke the silence. She asked if her father was happy. Richard smiled, holding her a little tighter, and said yes, he was very happy that this had been a perfect day. Isabella agreed, saying it was the best birthday she had ever had. She talked about how she had enjoyed all the games, how her school friends were nice, how the cake was delicious. Then, with that sudden seriousness that sometimes takes hold of children, Isabella fell quiet again. Richard sensed she was thinking about something important, something she needed to say but didn't know how. He waited patiently, stroking his daughter's damp hair, giving her time and space to organize her thoughts. After a few minutes, Isabella finally spoke, her voice low but firm. She said she felt lucky to have a father like him, someone who loved her so much and would always protect her. She said she knew many children weren't so lucky, that she had learned this in her conversations with Dr. Souza, and that even when she was scared, even when she was in pain, she always knew her daddy would come to save her, that he would never truly leave her alone. Richard felt his eyes fill with tears. He kissed the top of Isabella's head, unable to speak for a moment, too moved by his daughter's sincere words when he finally found his voice. He whispered that he was the lucky one for having such an incredible, brave daughter, so full of love despite everything she had been through. He said she was the most important thing in his life, that she always would be, and that protecting her was not a sacrifice but a privilege, the most important honor he could have. They stayed like that for a few minutes, just enjoying each other's presence, the comfortable silence of two people who loved each other deeply. Eventually, Richard carried Isabella to her room and tucked her into bed. He read a story as he did every night, this time a fairy tale about a brave princess who saved herself. When he finished reading, Isabella was almost asleep, but she murmured a final, "I love you, Daddy," before closing her eyes completely. Richard turned off the light, leaving only the star-shaped nightlight that Isabella liked, and quietly left the room. He returned to the porch, where he sat and looked at the starry sky. The ranch was silent, peaceful, at peace. He thought about the future, about all the things he still wanted to do with Isabella, all the memories they would still create together. He thought about how she would grow up, become a strong and independent woman, and how he would be there every step of the way, supporting her, loving her, protecting her. But above all, Richard thought about the most important lesson he had learned from this whole ordeal, that true love requires courage, it requires action, it requires being willing to fight for the truth, even when it's hard. He had done that for Isabella, and he would do it again 1,000 times if necessary. Green Valley Stud would continue to be there, home, but now it was a genuine home, built on solid foundations of truth and unconditional love. There were no more secrets, no more lies, no more people pretending to be what they were not, just a father and his daughter, a small family that had survived the storm and come out stronger on the other side. Richard got up from the porch, stretching his tired muscles but satisfied with the honest exhaustion of a day well lived. He went inside, carefully locking the doors and turning off the lights one by one. Before going to his room, he stopped once, more at Isabella's door, watching her sleep peacefully in the soft light of the star-shaped lamp. The girl had a small smile on her face as she slept, and Richard wondered what she was dreaming about. He hoped they were good dreams, full of the day's games, of friends, of laughter. He hoped the nightmares were finally in the past, that she could grow up without the weight of trauma defining every aspect of her life. He thought of all the plans he had for them. Isabella had mentioned an interest in learning music, perhaps the piano. Richard was already researching the best teachers in the region. He also wanted to take her traveling, to show her the world beyond Lexington, beyond the ranch. He wanted her to have rich and diverse experiences, to know different cultures, to broaden her horizons. But most of all, he wanted her to be happy, as simple as that, to wake up every day feeling loved and safe, to be able to pursue her dreams without fear, to know that she would always have a safe harbor to return to, a father who would support her unconditionally in whatever path she chose. Tomorrow would be a new day with new challenges and new joys. Maybe Isabella would have a tough day at school, or maybe something would trigger an uncomfortable memory. But no matter what the future brought, Richard knew they would be ready to face it together, because now they had something that had been tested and proven stronger than any adversity, the love between a father and daughter, pure, true, unbreakable. And that night, for the first time in a long time, Richard Thompson went to bed, not just hopeful, but genuinely confident. confident that he had done the right thing, confident that Isabella would grow up strong and healthy, confident that the future, despite all of life's inevitable uncertainties, would be bright for both of them. He slept deeply, without nightmares, without worries to keep him awake, only with the serene peace of a man who knew he had honored his most sacred responsibility to protect and love his daughter above all else. The next morning, when the sun rose over Green Valley Stud, illuminating the paddocks and stables with its golden light, the rancher woke to another day. Isabella would wake up soon, run to her father's room asking for pancakes for breakfast, and they would begin another day of their journey together. A journey that had begun in tragedy and pain, but continued with hope, love, and the unwavering certainty that, together, they could overcome any obstacle life placed in their path.